G20 leaders adopt the New Delhi Declaration with complete consensus. The joint statement fails to condemn Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but warns against the threat of using nuclear weapons. India also hands over the G20 presidency to Brazil. President Lula says that the Brazilian presidency will focus on accelerating the fight against global hunger and climate finance. India announces the first of its kind infrastructure and connectivity pact with West Asia and Europe at the G20 summit. Says the soon-to-be-launched India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor aims for stronger trade ties and energy flow from the Gulf to Europe via railways and ports linked to India. In a clean energy push, the G20 also announces a global biofuels alliance with India, the US and Brazil as founding members. Wall Street ends lower for the week despite a positive close on Friday. A stronger than expected macro data reignites fears of rate hikes by the Federal Reserve. Stocks in the Asia-Pacific open largely lower ahead of key macro data from India and then China later in the week. The GIFT Nifty, meanwhile, implies a higher start for the Indian market. Oil prices come off slightly from a 9-month high. Brent crude, however, holds above the $90 a barrel mark on expectations of tight supply after Saudi Arabia and Russia extend production cuts. And Morocco's strongest earthquake on record claims over 2,100 lives. Officials say the rare 6.8 magnitude earthquake has left at least 2,400 people injured and several more are feared trapped under the debris in remote areas. Good morning and welcome to Power Breakfast. I'm Pavitra Parekh. Those are the top headlines that we have for you as we get into this brand new trading week. There's a lot for us to talk about. The G20 meet has just gotten over. So a lot of cues coming through from there as well. But let's kickstart the show by talking about the global markets, which Asia, for starters, is definitely not looking so good. Largely lower right now, with Hang Seng really leading the losses this morning. So it's over 1% gone in terms of the cut that you're seeing for the Hong Kong market. So it's 1.3% lower over there. The Taiwanese index also, it's actually slipped further in the past 10 minutes or so. So it's currently around 0.7% in the red. The Nikkei market around 0.2% lower. You have Straits also trading with a little bit of a cut coming through. So the only markets which are holding up in the green are the Shanghai and the Kospi. Not too much higher there, just around 0.3% on both of these markets. So that's what's happening across Asia. The GIFT Nifty will be up for you. And it is indicating that the start for our own markets, despite this kind of red screen across Asia, despite the fact that, Brent is also continuing to hold above 90. The implied open for our own markets is a little bit higher. So 50 points in the green is where we're at for our own markets. But let's also talk about the US then, because we did end positive on Friday for Wall Street. So the Dow was, up around 75 points. Like you can see, it wasn't too much of a gain coming through, but it was a close in the green at least. The S&P 500 was up around 0.1%, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq eked out just a marginal gain, so 12 points like you can see on the Nasdaq. But if you look at it for the week, then all three major indices closed the week on a lower note. So the Dow was, down 0.8% like you can see. S&P was down 1.3%, and the Nasdaq was perhaps the worst. It was down almost 2%. In terms of the key cues to track this week, it is, of course, going to be a lot about the inflation data because that is due on Wednesday. This is the CPI reading for August. And, of course, very important for us to track ahead of the Fed's policy meeting, which is going to be next week. So that's what we're tracking in terms of the big global cue. But let's also listen into former Federal Reserve Board Governor Frederick Mishkin. And he talks about his expectations from the Federal Reserve September policy meet. Listen in.
No, I'm actually on board with skipping right now. That I think the Fed is basically in a good place. They've done something that was very important, which is going back a little bit, which is they had these very rapid rises, even with a lot of resistance from the markets and politicians and so forth. And that actually convinced people that they were serious about controlling inflation, and that stabilized inflation expectations. And research shows that actually a key driver of inflation is inflation expectations.
All right, that is some important opinion coming in, and that's what we're looking at in terms of the global action. But let's now talk about all of the cues that you should track as we get into this market open and all of the individual stocks that you should have on your radar as well. We have Vivek and Surbi joining us. Nigel will also be with us in just a few minutes to take us through the trade setup this morning. Guys, a very good morning to both of you. Vivek, coming to you first, take us through what we should track because this is a week where we have a lot of important domestic as well as global cues to track.
Well, good morning. That's absolutely right. A lot of important cues to keep an eye out for. Like you mentioned, we are looking at the handover, slightly muted handover. Although U.S. markets, ended Friday's session in the green, all of the key indices as far as U.S. were concerned ended last week with cuts. Now, talking about oil prices now are trading at a 9-month high, and that continues to remain a worry. Brent futures trading closer to the $90 a barrel mark. Now, talking about the Indian markets on Friday, as well as in the week gone by, were clear outperformers. Indian market, in fact, went up for the 6th straight session. Friday's activity was largely aided by heavyweights moving higher, Reliance, L&T, as well as HDFC Bank, all of them moved higher. Now, talking about the mid-cap index continued to roar higher. Mid-cap, small-cap index trading near lifetime highs. And in the week gone by, the key outperforming sectors, and it'll be interesting to see and important to see whether this outperformance will continue. So metals, PSU stocks, especially the CPSE index, as well as oil and gas name, all of them moved higher in the week gone by. A lot of key events today. Number one, we'll be watching out for the monthly data that will be released by AMFI. Also, Rishabh Instruments list today. And also remember, Jupiter Hospitals, the IPO on last day, oversubscribed by almost 64 times. One other important key development to keep an eye out for, TVS Supply Chain would be declaring its results today. It's the latest company that was listed on the exchanges. Like you mentioned, Asian markets very muted start. GIFT Nifty, however, is implying a positive start for our own markets.
All right, and we're going to take that with both hands, considering we've already had such a good week, and it looks like we're going to get around a 50-point bump up at the start of the trading session. Vivek, thanks a lot for that. Let's also talk about the individual stocks that we should have on our radar. Surbhi is here to fill us in with the entire weekend's worth of action. Surbhi.
Thanks so much for that. So the first one on my radar is Reliance and Tata Group stocks, as Nvidia enters into a partnership with both with both those groups to bring advanced AI technology in India. Next is PVR Inox. That will also be on my radar on the back of strong opening weekend collections from the movie Jawan, and also the company opens 4-screen multiplex at Karnataka. SJVN, the company signs a power purchase agreement to develop a solar project. ICICI Bank, the company receives an RBI nod to make iProcess Services a wholly owned subsidiary. The bank currently holds 19% stake in the company. Gateway Distriparks, Sandeep Kumar Shaw resigns as the CFO of the company with effect from November 28th. And lastly, Sham Metallics and Energy, the company announces an OFS of 5.1% stake with an option to sell another 1.19% stake. The shares are offered at a floor price of 414 rupees per share. Thank you.
All right, Surbhi, thanks a lot for getting us all of those individual stock-specific cues that we should track as well. That is, all of the action that we're looking at. Of course, like we were mentioning, Brent is over $90 a barrel, so that would be very important to watch as well. The regular oil impact, on the paint companies, aviation, and of course, ONGC Oil India is also something that we will be looking at. Like Vivek was mentioning, there's a new listing as well. So Rishabh Instruments, that is the one that we are tracking this morning. But with that, let's also now talk about all of the cues from the futures and options space. Nigel is here to fill us in with those details. Nigel, looks like the start will be in the green, but take us through what we should track.
Well, that's right. Green to start, and it was a very good trading session on Friday itself. Besides the lower FI selling that we saw, we did see a bout of short covering that played out, both on the Nifty as well as the Nifty Bank. What did the FIs do? Well, they added some long positions and they covered some shorts. And that takes long positioning to around 58%. Well, on the option side, there was both call as well as put buying. And even on the writing side, both calls as well as puts were written. Which brings us to the levels. We're looking at support around 19,725 odd, going by the options data. And the next level of support comes in at around the 50 DMA. We're likely to start off gap up, but we'll have to see how the day trends from there. 20,000, that's the target that the bulls have on their radar. Back to you.
All right, let's see if we can get to that 20,000 mark this week or not. Last week, like we were pointing out, was very solid, and it looks like the start today as well is going to definitely be in the green. But with that, it is time for a short break on the show. On the other side, we're going to get you all of the highlights and key takeaways from the G20 summit that took place over the weekend. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back. You're still tuned into Power Breakfast here on CNBC TV18. Now, let's talk about all of the highlights that came through from the G20 summit, which concluded in Delhi yesterday. Now, the summit has been a significant one on many counts. So, under India's presidency, the grouping reached complete consensus and adopted the New Delhi Declaration. However, while the statement made a mention of the war in Ukraine, it left out any direct condemnation of the Russian aggression. The other big takeaway, a major trilateral infrastructure deal was announced. India, West Asia and Europe are all set to launch the first of its kind Trade and Connectivity Pact. And the India, Middle East and Europe Economic Corridor. Note that this pact rivals China's One Belt, One Road initiative. So that was important, that came through as well. And after months of New Delhi's recommendation, the 55-member-strong African Union is also part of the grouping. Finally, the big other takeaway, of course, is that India has now handed over the G20 presidency to Brazil and called for a virtual session at the end of November. So the next G20 summit will be held in Rio de Janeiro in November of next year. So those are some important takeaways that came through from the G20 summit. But with that, let's also bring you an exclusive now. Sunil Bharati Mittal, chair of B20 Africa Council, said that the inclusion of the African Union in G20 is a defining moment. He called on world leaders for a reset of Africa's debt and further added that Airtel remains bullish on the region. Listen in.
Today's inclusion of African Union as a permanent member of G20, which today has become one of the most important bodies globally, signals that you cannot leave large continents like Africa behind. Even countries like Zambia, which were having tremendous amount of deposits of copper and were doing reasonably well, have fallen into huge debt traps. Countries which are oil-producing countries like Angola, Gabon, and many others are also in huge debt. And this needs a reset. To my mind, a debate must ensue amongst the global leaders how to write off most of these loans once and reset Africa into the next order. By giving large amounts of debt, for example, from China, and then securing long-term supply chains on critical minerals and metals, oil and gas, Africa has been deprived of continuous income that is required to build their own infrastructure, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Well, we remain very bullish on Africa, African growth. I mean, Africa has been growing for Airtel at 20% every year in constant currency, which is absolutely stunning growth for a company that you can double in about 4 years' time, your total revenue. The only problem in Africa has been currency depreciation. So in terms of currency depreciation, it's a matter of great worry. And as the economies of Africa will stabilize, so would the currencies.
All right, that's a very important word coming in from Sunil Bharati Mittal on the situation in Africa and what world leaders can really do in order to lend support at this point. But Shireen also spoke with the president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, on the World Bank's focus on additional lending, stating that the World Bank needs to broaden the horizon to food security and gender equality as well. So listen into that as too.
Germany announced some things today. Others are in the pipeline. By the time our annual meeting happens in Marrakesh, we're thinking that all this put together could get us to between $100 and $150 billion of lending. The idea that somehow this will all come from multilateral banks or the generosity of the richer world, I don't think we should do that. I think you should view that as seed capital, as the foundation on which the private sector must come. One of the things the private sector can do really well with multilateral institutions and the like is to get more bankable projects on the ground. We need to help them do that. The private sector has to work with us to create bankable projects.
All right, that is the word from Ajay Banga. And remember, we're going to keep bringing you conversations from the G20 summit through the day on CNBC TV18. But for now, it is time for a short break. When we come back, we're tracking all of the cues from the commodity markets. There's a lot happening there as well. So stay tuned and we'll bring you all of the details. Welcome back. You're still tuned into Power Breakfast, and let's talk about the commodities now. Manisha joins us with an update. Manisha, take us through all of the action. The crude markets remain extremely hot.
Oh, well, absolutely, Pavitra. Even with 2% of gain in the previous week and some slide right now, we are still holding above $90 a barrel for this one. The lower supplies from U.S., Russia, and Saudi Arabia continue to support the markets. It's going to be extremely important this week because we have the IEA and the OPEC monthly reports coming in. The strength in U.S. dollar, which is still trading at a 6-month high, continues to weigh. But as I said, it's going to be a lot of data. And this week from U.S., you have the inflation, trade numbers, and industrial production coming in. You also have the European Central Bank interest rate decision this week itself. And then the markets will watch out for the Indian inflation data that comes in tomorrow and the industrial output numbers that come in tomorrow as well. So there's loads of data coming in from all over the world, and that is going to keep the markets choppy. Having said that, we haven't started the day on a very strong note there. So it is consolidation, even some profit taking is how we've begun this week.
All right, Manisha, thanks a lot for getting us all of that action from the commodity markets. With that, we have to wind down on this edition of Power Breakfast with the news that the Asian markets are pretty mixed right now. The implied open for our own markets is around 50 points higher. So thanks for tuning into Power Breakfast. We're going to wind down on that note, but Bazaar Morning Call comes up next to take all of this action forward.